Hi everybody, it's Chris, and welcome to another video by the Infinity System. This time around, we're reviewing Episode 2 of Moon Knight. Episode 1, we had some really mixed results, but they really also weren't giving us much to work with at the time, so we ended up with an even mix between violent misrepresentations and proper representation, truthful, as signified by the heart and the feather, respectively. If you want to know exactly what that's all about, go back and rewatch Episode 1, so we'll save time explaining it now. As said, Episode 2 actually turned out to be much better, or at least we felt that it did, than Episode 1. A lot more to work with there. Basically, at this point, however, we've decided to just go ahead and hold off on the violence, since this is a Marvel superhero series. That's only to be expected, and we will only award Human Hearts for those instances where we feel that the violence is tied directly to one alter versus another, or specifically within the DID system or relevant to DID. So we're going to leave that out to kind of winnow things down just a little bit. So, on with the show. Okay, at 1:55 we have Stephen awaking in bed, chained and frustrating at, again, missing time. This is absolutely truthful, so we're going to award it 1 feather. At around the 2 o'clock mark, an angry Stephen attempts to contact or confront his alter Mark through the mirrors of his bathroom. This was actually a nice touch of using the French door-style mirror to multiply the reflections. So 1 feather for content and 1 for style. This brings us to Stephen arriving at work, only to see the security guard from before, who called him Scott, roping the area to the bathroom off, which apparently is indeed in shambles. The security guard agrees to watch the security footage with Stephen first before going to the boss, and they go into the security office to review it. But, as expected, there's nothing there on the critical parts of the tape, implying heavily that it was either invisible or in Stephen's head entirely. Now, what is interesting at this point is that despite Stephen having seen the creature during the attack itself, now on the videotape, he is not able to see it. So either A, they're invisible to video, or B, again, this is implying that it's all in his head. Either way, we're going to give this 1 heart. Brings us to a few seconds on when Stephen views the footage of the body leaving the bathroom. It's clearly Mark in the body, looking straight at the security camera, knowing that Stephen will be looking back at him later. We'll give this 1 feather. We've actually seen and experienced this ourselves on recordings. At about the 5-minute 30-second mark, his boss states that because of the bathroom incident, he's fired, but they won't press charges. And he encourages Stephen to get help with a local mental health facility, stating that, ironically, he's not alone. Where does that sound familiar from? Anyway, Stephen Riley then remarks that, yeah, well, that's the problem, isn't it? Okay, right here, that's a beautiful comment, and we're going to award double feathers for humor and also a real insight into this contradiction of being profoundly alone and yet never alone. And that's something that only someone who works with DID or is a DID sufferer themselves would actually get. So kudos to them, double feathers. At the 6-minute 30-second mark, the boss demands Stephen's name tag, thus metaphorically and perhaps practically stripping him or loosening the holds of this identity as Stephen. And having been on the receiving end of the HR bullshit like this, we're going to award a feather both for the context and decent writing in this scenario. At about 7:23, Stephen tracks down the storage unit that matches the key that he found back at the apartment in Episode 1. We're going to give 1 feather for showing how complex alter behavior can be, because Stephen has to search all across the city to the various branches in order to match up the key. This does show just how alters can hide things from other system members, or even at times lead completely separate lives. We haven't experienced this ourselves, but we do know that it does happen. So 1 feather for that. As Stephen opens the unit, he discovers Mark's belongings, a cot, cases, and a duffel bag with a gun, money, and passports in it with Mark's name. He also finds the story MacGuffin, the scarab, which is revealed to be a compass of sorts. That's more storyline versus DID related. But 1 feather for showing, again, just how disparate alters can be in tastes and attitudes and ways of acting, even though admittedly we are talking extremes here. So, a little bit further on, at about the 10:22 mark, Stephen sees Mark in the reflections of the conveniently mirrored room. How much stainless steel do you need for the inside of one storage unit? Things that make you go, Stephen then inquires directly about Mark possessing him or being a demon. Now, this is kind of a squiggly one to award, because this is a common trope with NTs and certain folks in certain circles, that it's nothing more than a religious possession. So, one feather for acknowledging a common misconception about DID, but also one heart for not giving it the proper context and or missing an opportunity to debunk this, frankly, nasty little misconception. Okay, so moving on, at about the 11-minute mark, Mark fills Stephen in about being Khonshu's avatar in story time, and backstory occurs. Now, at this point, after learning all of these things and putting things together, Stephen begins to have a panic attack, as his brain is overwhelmed by the circumstances, everything that he's had to endure, and now what Mark is telling him. This was very well shown. It was a very realistic depiction to a system's reaction, or a trauma victim's reaction to circumstances and internal conflict that is out of control. So, one feather, very well earned for showing that. A few moments on, Mark asks to front, but Stephen refuses and grabs the bag of stuff, leaving with it and claiming that he'd rather go to the police and locked away for safety than listen to Mark any farther. Again, we're going to award this one feather because this more than adequately shows the fear and denial that can come along with knowing that you have an alter that is non-co with you, discovering all of these things and discovering that these blank holes in your life are in fact due to something else. It's going to make you question your sanity and, make you want to jump right into some place where maybe they'll commit you and lock you away where you won't be a harm to yourself or other folks, which can happen and does. So, one feather awarded for that. Right after this, Khonshu makes his rather dramatic appearance to Stephen, thus proving that he was not simply a hallucination as we had surmised in episode 1. A few moments later, Khonshu is indeed confirmed as the gruff voice or persecutor alter from before, but obviously we know at this point he is not an alter. But the question becomes, is he an internal manifestation of the god or an external manifestation? Still leaving that slightly open. So just for that confirmation, we're going to go ahead and give it one feather. Grudgingly, but one feather. At this point, Stephen, losing his shit, runs from Khonshu outside, still clutching the duffel bag, and runs straight into our lady love Layla, who obviously is the femme fatale of our little series here, who then rescues him, believing that he is Mark. Through the course of a very uncomfortable ride for Stephen on the back of Layla's motorcycle, Layla continually thinks that it is Mark pretending to be someone else. We're going to go ahead and award this one feather for showing the confusion that can hit NTs when they suddenly realize that they are dealing with a system with alters, and that, yes, indeed, these are separate people. However, Layla's not quite up to the task, but just yet. However, we're still going to award that feather. So, at this point, Stephen goes ahead and convinces Layla to take him to his apartment. We have more interplay between alters with the reflections in the fish tank, and Mark objects to Layla's appearance there, saying to get her out and that he doesn't know what he's dealing with. Stephen, however, is fed up at this point and is ignoring him. But the chatter does go on, and we're going to award one feather here for showing just how damn distracting and irritating it can be to try to focus on where you're at when the internal dialogue and bickering is going on. So, good representation there, even if it's buried a little bit. Shortly after, Layla reveals that Mark and his mother don't talk in an offhand comment. Now, this is interesting because in the previous episode, we have seen Stephen leaving multiple messages for his mother, and yet she never responds. So here's another piece of the puzzle falling into place, because obviously Mother and Mark are estranged, most likely due to Mark's actions. So while this doesn't quite merit a full feather on its own, it still is an interesting story point and a direct reference to the memory loss that can come with DID. Okay, now Layla still thinks that he's Mark at this point, despite some romantic leanings over the word structure of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. And getting frustrated, she reveals that she's here to sign divorce papers, which apparently Mark initiated. Stephen, of course, states that he would never divorce her, being quite smitten, and that this Mark guy is, quote, a right twit. Interesting story development, but not quite worth a feather there. Now, at this point, Mark is still pleading with Stephen from the Aegis of the Mirror to stop talking, stop filling in Layla, and that he's putting her in danger by revealing the scarab to her. Mark finally manages to convince Stephen to stop blabbing out at the mouth when he states that revealing the scarab to her will put a target on her back, and that if she dies, it's on his hands. Now, at this point, we're going to go ahead and award one feather because Mark is attempting to do a direct influence move and succeeds with it. So instead of passive influence, here we see a case of active or direct influence. So, with this threat, Stephen eventually does listen, but Layla has clued into the fact that the scarab is in the bag anyway, and literally the scarab is out of the bag. So again, just the one feather for showing the active influence from an altar. At this point, Stephen basically breaks down and asks Layla for help. He says that he's out of his depth, he doesn't know what's going on, doesn't know who this Mark guy is, but obviously he's nothing like him and begs her for help. At this point, we're going to go ahead and give one feather for what is a realistic depiction of the fear and denial that comes with suddenly learning that you are a multiple and then yearning and reaching out for help. Now we come to the obligatory sequence with the fake police officers who kidnap him and take him away in an unmarked car. Layla gets away with the scarab, and during the car ride to an unknown destination, the two pseudo-cops dig up Mark's past, and specifically the incident about the Egyptian dig and the mercenary work, stating that the victims there were shot in the back of the head, execution style. Stephen, understandably, is repulsed and denies ever having done this. That's not me. Shortly after, Mark attempts to force a switch, forcing Stephen out of the front. Now we're going to go ahead and give this one feather of truth just simply because it is possible for an altar to attempt to force a switch from the inside. It's not a great idea, but it can happen if you don't have good communication. Stephen, of course, refuses to surrender the front, and after this so-called test, Harrow shows up, uncuffs him, and suddenly starts acting very kind, the cops having been, all the time, of course, members of the cult that Harrow has started. Now, it's interesting here, and here we come to it, because at this point in the conversation, Harrow makes a statement that it must be confusing with all the voices inside your head. Stephen Grant, Mark Spector, Khonshu. I'm curious, do you think that Khonshu chose you as his avatar because your mind would be easy to break, or because it was broken already? Okay, let's just stop right here and dissect this, shall we? We're going to go ahead and award this with 2 human hearts, a double strike for perpetrating the idea that dissociative conditions are the result of a weak mind instead of the actual incredible coping mechanism that dissociation and DID is, and another strike for the fact that the mentally ill are portrayed again as being broken. This is not the best representation, but it is not surprising given that it is a line literally lifted from the comic books. However, it does stand out that Marvel still put it in there. But, immediately afterwards, Stephen states that he is not broken and just in need of help. Double points here for Stephen refuting Harrow directly despite being more or less a passive alter or personality, and for Marvel reversing the trope that they had just used that we were complaining about. At this point, Khonshu appears to Stephen and begins to kick up a fuss that Stephen is talking to Harrow. Harrow is aware of Khonshu's presence but can't see him, and at this point we learn that Harrow was in fact Khonshu's previous avatar before Mark, but cannot see him, as he puts, "I don't have that privilege anymore." Khonshu at this point tells Stephen to kill Harrow, who immediately knows exactly what Khonshu was going to say. No points awarded for being DID related, but definitely an amusing interchange. At this point, Harrow does say something interesting. He says, "Just remember, you don't have to do everything he," referring to Khonshu, "asks." Now this is interesting because it reveals both the limits of Khonshu's power over his avatar, who must apparently consent to the actions, and a possible awareness of the interplay that occurs between alters. Or is that reading too much into this instance? We'll give a double feather here for portraying Khonshu as a persecutor and a protector role, but also giving us confirmation that Khonshu, while having access to Mark/Stephen's mind, is external to the body and not an alter. At this point in the narrative, Harrow shows our reluctant hero the community of Ammut's judged people, who appear to be a bit brainwashed in their little agrarian city utopia. However, there is a nice bit of superimposition with the action of the hummingbird in the background when Ammut's avatar, obviously Harrow, begins to show her power. Just an artistic note, but still. Shortly after this, as they're sitting down for a lentil bean soup, Khonshu states that he only harms those who have already hurt others, or rather that he has his avatar harm those who have already hurt others. Now this could be a philosophical tie-in to the awareness or desire for retribution in a trauma victim. At some point in our processing, we're going to get angry and want to take out that pound of flesh, as it were, on our abusers. So is this an awareness of that that's been written into the narrative? Maybe we're reaching here, but we're going to go ahead and award it one feather of truth anyway. At this point, Harrow reveals the master plan of Ammit, and, of course, demands the scarab that, at this point, Stephen honestly doesn't have. Now, at this point, obviously, Mark begins to address Stephen, asking him to let him out so that he can deal with the situation. Interesting point here. Harrow not only picks up on this and believes in Mark as an alter and a full individual, but addresses him by name via the reflection in the bowl of fruit there. This is a good representation of an alter being presented as a real individual to someone who is an NT, apparently. So for that, we award it one feather of truth. Now here, Harrow reveals in a chilling bit of conversation, perhaps a bit of foreshadowing for Mark's past, that yes, the cult will kill impure children too, which he justifies with the logic of the limb of the diseased tree must be amputated for the good of the whole. Yeah, right. Stephen, of course, objects and says, kind of draw a line where that goes, in which case Harrow shoots him a look that says that there might be more to Mark's past than we're currently being shown. We'll see how that plays out. At this point in the narrative, our Lady Layla shows up with the scarab, tells Stephen to summon the suit, shoves the scarab into his arms, and they book for it. Shortly after, as they're running up an impossibly long set of stairs, doesn't there always seem to be one of those in an evil villain's lair? Layla calls Stephen by his name directly, addressing him as the person being in front of the body. This we award one feather for NT effort. Now at this point, of course, not happy that our lovely lady and our hero are running away with the scarab, Harrow summons Ammut's monster, which turns out to be another one of these jackal creatures, and that pursues after them, with the monster hot on their heels and them in what Stephen says humorously is a mad scientist's man cave. Layla then attempts to contact Mark directly and force a switch. At this point, we're going to give 2 hearts for not addressing the host and for attempting to address an alter that is not at the front and force a switch to them. This is just bad etiquette and a bad idea all the way around. It's not proper, it disrespects the altar at the front, and on a more practical level, this should not be done because of what immediately happens to Stephen afterwards, who shows all the signs of suffering a TITH headache, a transitional interpersonality thunderclap headache, which is caused by the changes in the blood pressure in the brain when forced switching or hard switching or flashbacks can occur. So, one feather for a very real representation of when a TITH happens and why. At this point, our invisible jackal stops beating on the doors, breaks them down, and it's proven that Layla cannot see it. Stephen gets knocked out of the window, falls, and finally manages to summon the suit and strikes a lovely superhero pose in Mr. Knight's new outfit and promptly falls over on his ass. Can't so we blame him, he's just shifted into a superhero identity and fallen out of a 3-story window in the process. At this point, of course, with a convenient window to provide a reflection as the basis for our alter argument, Mark and Stephen argue over the form of the suit, with Mark explaining that it's supposed to be the more ancient Egyptian-style armor of Khonshu, while Stephen argues that, hey, at least they do have good taste and look good in the kind of 3-piece suit. Personally, we think it looks ridiculous, but hey. This does, however, demonstrate the various tastes and style preferences of alters within a system, so for that we're going to award it 1 feather of truth. Now at this point, of course, our jackal comes onto the scene, still chasing its prey, and Stephen proceeds to fight with it, and refuses to surrender the body to Mark, claiming that he thinks that he can handle it. At this point, Stephen takes his best shot and lures the jackal away from the street people and also Layla, and in the process discovers his power when he punches the jackal, sending him flying. Now at this point, however, we have to focus on this point. 2 women who are watching the events in the crowd make the following crack. Do you reckon he's having a seizure? And the other lady says, nah, look at him, he's just a Nancy drunk. Let's unpack this just a little bit. Now, while this instant is played for comedy and solely for comedy, we have to look at the underlying surface here. It depends basically on 2 common tropes, for which we're going to award 2 human hearts. One for depicting mental illness symptoms as the results of a brain seizure, and also one for implying substance abuse. Now, while again the context here clearly is comedy, it's the underpinnings of this bit that is where the misrepresentation lies, and is where it needs to be addressed. The devil, as they say, is in the details, or in this case, the Moon Knight. Now at this point, Stephen has been handily getting his butt beat by the jackal, and again has a conversation in a bus window with Mark, who points out that there's going to be quite a lot of collateral damage and that Stephen is in over his head. At this point, Stephen finally does decide to relinquish the body, but says just for now. Why do we get the feeling that that's not going to happen rapidly? But we're skipping ahead. At this point, we give 1 feather for an honest, if rather dramatic, cooperation between alters. Now at this point, we have an uber dramatic switch, and the magical Egypt armor appears. I wish we got that every time that we switched. Hook us up, Marvel. Anyway, Mark then leads the jackal away from Layla and the innocent townspeople cracking jokes, and eventually impales it on the roof of a building, and promptly the jackal falls into sand, nice and self-cleaning. Very, very convenient. Nothing even to sweep up. I wonder if it leaves a fresh scent of pine. Regardless, at this point, Mark realizes that he can't find the scarab and that he's dropped it somewhere along the way. Cut to the poor street guy who has it, discovers it, only promptly to have Harrow come up, demand it of him, rather ask him for it, and promptly kill him for cooperating. At this point, our lady Layla witnesses what Harrow does, but instead of pursuing him or acting shocked, instead simply turns away on her motorbike, again implying that perhaps Layla is indeed, as Mark says, not all that she appears, and that she has some history with Harrow. To be revealed later, we're hoping. Now at this point, in what is probably one of the most uncomfortable and yet at the same time realistic part of the show, Stephen and Mark have a conversation, Ray being inside. At this point, Stephen is trapped in what they represent as the headspace and absolutely hates it. He can't move and basically describes what essentially is sleep paralysis symptoms, where you are frozen and filled with fear. Mark states that it will get easier, which is indeed an interesting nod to sleep paralysis, but that is not directly connected to the action in the headspace. And that's just not the way that the headspace works. After Stephen asks how long this has been going on, Mark reveals that this, the DID between the 2 of them, has been going on for a very long time. So again, in this case, we're going to give 1 feather for actually representing the headspace, but 1 heart for misrepresenting the nature of it as a prison rather than more of just a gathering area for the various altars where no one in particular is in control. Now at this point, Stephen requests the body back and Mark flatly refuses. Stephen now attempts to force switch from within the headspace. At this point, we're going to go ahead and give 1 feather for attempting to show active influence again, despite the cracking mirror metaphor. Stephen cannot switch back, and Mark states that lately something has changed, that the one who controls the body is the stronger, but that most of the time it will require all of Stephen's attention to, quote, just be a fly on the wall, which again is not how the headspace works. So again, 1 heart for misrepresentation of the headspace as a prison and judicial use of the cracked mirror trope. Now, at this point, Stephen states his anger to Mark that Mark is the reason for all of the difficulties in his life, his inability to keep a job, to have a date, etc. And this is a very realistic depiction of, the confusion that can come in when you finally do discover that you're a multiple and that they've been doing things without you. Mark then inquires what type of servitude that Khonshu requires of them. Mark states, the kind that leaves me covered in blood. And at this point, Stephen makes an interesting and telling comment. He states, yeah, but that blood is on my hands. And then promptly gets into argument with Mark over Layla. We're going to give 1 feather of truth for showing and naming the common difficulties that are endemic to DID. Different jobs, difficulties with dates, difficulties in your regular life, things that the ANPs are created to deal with. And 1 feather for attempting to show system responsibility with Stephen's reply, basically saying that what you do doesn't just affect you, but affects me and the body and everybody outside. Now at this point in the argument, Mark frankly just freaks out and proceeds to break the mirror violently, physically and definitely metaphorically sealing Stephen inside the headspace. This is a moment of intense violence that is directed directly at an altar, Stephen by Mark. So we have to give this 2 hearts for direct altar-on-altar violence, and again portraying the headspace as a prison under the control of whoever is currently fronting. And you guys were doing so well. Shortly after this act of violence, Khonshu decides to round out Mark about Stephen's interference in their plans, and Khonshu indeed presses home the point that without him, Mark would not even be alive, and states that, do you think that you're in control of this body? The body belongs to me. Now at this point, what's curious is that Khonshu actually seems to soften somewhat, stating that he will do everything that he can to protect Mark, and that Mark is, quote-unquote, worth protecting. Given the gentleness in Khonshu's voice, is this perhaps a nod to the uncovered childhood trauma that would have caused Stephen/Mark's DID? Irregardless, it's a curiously compassionate statement from what has been a rather derisive and violent entity thus far. So, 1 heart and 1 feather. And in classic fashion, this moment of tenderness is promptly followed up by Khonshu coercing Mark with the knowledge that Khonshu has his eyes on Layla for his next avatar, should Mark want to throw in the towel. Obviously, this is a nasty little mark of manipulation, but we've already awarded 1 heart for his rough behavior before, so we'll let this one slide. With Khonshu's latest bit of coercion sitting ill in his mouth, Mark asks where they're headed to next. Khonshu appropriately replies, "Where the hell do you think?" Cut to black and pan in on the next scene with Stephen unhappily trapped in the mirror of a trashed hotel room and Mark drunk on the floor. Big reveal, move into the curtains, pull them aback only to discover that, as expected, they are in fact now in ancient Egypt, which presumably was the start of our story. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and give this 1 feather for a great depiction of the self-medication, self-loathing spiral. Mark knows that he's trapping Stephen and is attempting to self-soothe the guilt, so 1 feather for the depiction of substance abuse in order to deal with internal issues or trauma brought about by your DID condition. And at last, 1 final human heart for, again, like in Episode 1, Marvel placing a link to NAMI.org at the end of the episode. Literally, at the end. After everything else, except for the Marvel logo. Could easily stick it on the front, guys. Just saying, minor editing change. So let's go ahead and tally up those feathers of truth versus the human hearts, although I think it's pretty safe to say this time that Anubis will be weighing in on the sides of the feathers of truth. There we have it, handily. The feathers of truth outweigh the human hearts, showing that at least for this episode, episode 2 of the series, our representation of DID was far better shown. So, with far more information and contextual information to go on this time, episode 2 definitely shaped up as showing much better representation of DID and the comorbid conditions that go along with it. Will this trend continue? Will episode 3 give us even better representation yet? Time will tell, and we'll be around to review episode 3. In the meantime, you guys go ahead and drop your thoughts on episode 2 and what it showed and the realism of it in the comments section below. And at this point, as always, we'd like to remind you that you are loved, that you are strong, and that you're not alone. I'm Chris. Thanks for watching.